In British Columbia and the northwestern United States, the Sasquatch hardly needs an introduction. This elusive, wild, hairy giant, once an obscure character of First Nations lore, now serves as an icon of the Pacific Northwest. 8 years ago, it inspired Quasar, a monstrous mascot for the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, British Columbia. For 12 years, it has been featured in Messin' with Sasquatch, a series of hilarious Jack Link's beef jerky commercials in which it is portrayed as the vengeful enemy of outdoorsy pranksters. And for 16 years, it has shared its name with a famous Memorial Day music festival in George Washington, USA. Another institution to which the Sasquatch lent its name is the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, a ski hill tucked away in the Douglas Mountains, an hour's drive north of Chilliwack, British Columbia. The resort is aptly named as most of its runs wind down the northeastern slope of Mount Keenan, a formation once known as Mount Morris, and the birthplace of the word Sasquatch. On the road from Chilliwack to the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, in the vicinity of the bridge over the Harrison River, lies the Chehalis Indian Reserve, home of the Chehalis First Nation. The Chehalis people, not to be confused with their cousins from Puget Sound, with whom they share a name, are a Coast Salish people whose traditional territory revolves around the mouth of the Harrison River, a tributary of the Fraser. Back in 1925, an Irish expat named John Walter Burns became both the Indian agent and the school teacher at the Chehalis Reserve. Burns quickly earned the respect of the local natives and became fast friends with Frank Dan, a prominent Chehalis medicine man. In those days, the Chehalis people were typically reluctant to share their stories with white men for fear of ridicule. Since J.W. Burns had demonstrated an open-mindedness towards their myths and legends, however, they eventually opened up to him and made him privy to some of their most carefully guarded secrets. Among the most intriguing of these were tales of wild, hairy giants who, the Chehalis maintained, had inhabited the forest surrounding the reserve since time immemorial. In 1929, Burns compiled some of these stories and published them in an article in the April 1, 1929 issue of the Canadian magazine Maclean's, under the headline, Introducing BC's Hairy Giants, a collection of strange tales about British Columbia's wildmen as told by those who say they have seen them. The tales of hairy wildmen recounted in J.W. Burns' 1929 article in Maclean's magazine are some of the most colorful of their kind to date. The first of these anecdotes details the experience of a Chehalis Indian man named Peter Williams in May 1909. While walking in the woods along the foot of Mount Morris about a mile from the reserve, Williams heard a grunt in the bush. When he looked to see where the sound had come from, he found himself staring at what he first took to be a bear crouched atop a boulder about 30 feet away. As he raised his rifle to shoot the animal, it stood up and emitted a piercing scream. "It was a man," said Williams, "a giant no less than 6 1/2 feet in height and covered in hair. Enraged, the giant leapt from the boulder and tore after the Indian." "I never ran so fast before or since," said Williams, "through brush and undergrowth towards the Chehalis River, a tributary of the Harrison, where my dugout was moored." Every so often Williams glanced over his shoulder to check on his pursuer, who was quickly overtaking him. Williams narrowly escaped the monster by leaping into his boat and paddling downriver as fast as he could. The swift river, he said, did not in the least daunt the giant, for he began to wade it immediately. When he finally reached the safety of his cabin, Williams made sure that his wife and children were safe inside before bolting the door and barricading the entrance. Then, with my rifle ready, Williams said, I stood near the door and awaited his coming. After about 20 minutes, Williams heard a noise in the distance, somewhat akin to the trampling of a horse. The noise became louder and louder. Williams eventually looked through a crack between the logs of the cabin wall and saw that the giant was approaching. Darkness had not yet set in, he said, and I had a good look at him, except that he was covered with hair and twice the bulk of the average man. There was nothing to distinguish him from the rest of us. When the monster reached the cabin, he began pushing the walls so that the structure rocked back and forth. The cabin creaked and groaned, yet by some miracle it managed to maintain its integrity. Clutching his rifle with trembling hands, Williams whispered for his wife to take the children and hide under the bed. After prowling and grunting like an animal around the house, Williams continued, he went away. The family spent a restless night in the cabin, and in the morning Williams found the beast tracks in the mud outside, which were 22 inches long, but narrow in proportion to their length. The giant so damaged their cabin that Williams' family was forced to abandon it the following winter. Sometime later that season, Peter Williams went duck hunting on the north side of the Harrison River, about 2 miles from the reserve. Once again, he found himself face to face with the same hairy giant he had encountered the previous summer. As before, Williams ran for dear life, and the wild man chased after him. After about 400 yards, the giant broke off and wandered back into the woods. Interestingly, Peter's brother Paul encountered the same creature later that afternoon. While he was fishing for salmon in a creek near the reserve, the giant emerged from the forest and began to approach him. Terrified, Paul raced back towards his cabin with the monster hot on his heels. The giant gave up the chase shortly before Paul reached the cabin and walked back into the bush. Exhausted from fear and exertion, Paul collapsed in the snow and had to be carried inside by his mother and other relatives. The first and second time, Williams told J.W. Burns, I was all alone when I met this strange mountain creature. Then, early in the spring of the following year, another man and myself were bear hunting near the place where I found him. On this occasion, we ran into 2 of these giants. Initially, Williams and his companions thought the creatures were tree stumps. Suddenly, when they were about 50 feet away, the wild men who had been sitting on the ground rose to their feet. Burns and his companions stopped dead in their tracks. We were close enough to know they were man and woman, Williams said. The woman was the smaller of the 2, but neither of them as big or fierce-looking as the gent that chased me. Williams and his friend ran home and were not pursued. One morning, several weeks later, Williams and his wife were fishing in a canoe on the Harrison River, not far from the reserve. Upon paddling around a bend, they saw the same hairy giant that had destroyed their cabin the previous year. Fortunately, the monster took no notice of the Indians, and they made their escape without incident. Another wild man encounter Burns included in the article was the story of an elderly Indian named Charley Victor. Unlike Williams, Charley Victor was not a member of the Chehalis First Nation, but rather hailed from the Squaw Nation, a Coast Salish tribe from the Chilliwack area. The first time I came to know about these people, Victor said, I did not see anybody. On this particular occasion, Victor was foraging with 3 other men on a rocky mountain slope about 6 miles from Yale, a town which lies on the CPR's main line just north of Hope, British Columbia. He and his companions were picking salmon berries, wild fruits similar to raspberries. In our search for berries, Victor said, we suddenly stumbled upon a large opening in the side of the mountain. This discovery greatly surprised all of us, for we knew every foot of the mountain, and we never knew nor heard there was a cave in the vicinity. Near the cave's mouth was a massive boulder, which looked as though it once might have been employed as a primitive door. The natives cautiously approached the cave and peered inside, but were unable to see anything on account of the darkness. In order to combat this, they gathered pitchwood, a type of pine heartwood naturally saturated with flammable resin, lit it on fire, and began to explore. Not far from the mouth of the cave, the natives came upon a primitive stone house. We couldn't make a thorough examination, Victor explained, for our pitchwood kept going out. We left, intending to return in a couple of days and go on exploring. When Victor and his companions told the tale of their discovery to their fellow tribesmen back at the reserve, the elders warned them not to venture near it again, as it was surely occupied by a wild man. That was the first time I heard about the hairy men that inhabit the mountains, Victor told Burns. Disregarding the elders' advice, Victor and his companions went back to explore the cave. When they reached it, they discovered, to their astonishment, that the massive boulder that stood near the entrance had been rolled back over the mouth, fitting so perfectly that you might suppose it had been made for that purpose. About 20 years later, Charley, Victor, and a couple of his friends were bathing in a small lake near Yale, British Columbia. After Victor had finished his ablutions and was putting on his clothes, a big hairy man stepped out from behind a rock, only several feet away. He looked at me for a moment, Victor said. His eyes were so kind-looking that I was about to speak with him, when he turned about and walked into the forest. In around 1914, Charley Victor had a second encounter with a hairy wild giant while hunting in the mountains near the village of Hatzic, just east of Mission, British Columbia. Mission being a town on the banks of the Fraser River, located a half-hour drive from Chilliwack. On this excursion, Victor was accompanied by his dog. Upon hiking up to a plateau, his dog rushed over to a large cedar tree and began to growl and bark at it. Victor noticed that there was a large hole in the tree about 7 feet from the ground, and that his dog apparently wanted to enter it. Victor lifted his dog up and watched it scurry into the hole. Suddenly a muffled cry issued from within the tree. Victor raised his rifle, thinking that his dog had encountered a bear. Sure enough, something large crawled out of the hole and fell to the ground. Instinctively, Victor took a shot at it, an action which he immediately regretted, for there at his feet sprawled a bleeding, naked, black-haired Caucasian boy of about 13 years of age. Horrified, Victor dropped his rifle and approached the boy to examine the extent of his injury. He saw that he had shot the boy in the leg, but before he had a chance to dress the wound, the boy cried out as if appealing for help from the forest. From across the mountain, a long way off, Victor said, rolled a booming voice. Shortly thereafter, Victor heard the voice again, this time a little closer. The boy screamed again, as if in reply. Terrified though he was, Victor's conscience would not allow him to abandon the boy he had wounded. He waited on the plateau, his dog whimpering fearfully at his feet, while the boy guided his mysterious sylvan savior to his location. Less than a half hour later, said Victor, out of the depth of the forest came the strangest and wildest creature one could possibly see. The hairy creature, he continued, for that was what it was, walked toward me without the slightest fear. The wild person was a woman. Her face was almost negro black, and her long straight hair fell to her waist. In height, she would be about 6 feet, but her chest and shoulders were well above the average in breadth. Victor told Burns that although he had already met several wild men by this time, he had never seen anyone quite so savage in appearance as this woman. I'm sure that if that wild woman laid hands on me, Victor said, she'd break every bone in my body. The creature glanced at the boy before rounding on Victor, her face contorted with rage. Then something truly remarkable happened. Using the tongue of the Douglas First Nation, a branch of the Lillooet tribe, whose members lived at the northern end of Harrison Lake, the wild woman snarled, "You have shot my friend." Victor, who knew the Douglas language, replied that he had mistaken the boy for a bear, and that he was sorry. Ignoring him, the wild woman proceeded to dance around the boy, chanting the word Yahoo in a loud voice. Every time she vociferated, a similar reply came from the mountain. Soon, the wild woman was joined by another creature like her, who carried a 6-foot-long cord which Victor suspected was either a snake or the intestine of some animal, but whatever it was, he said, she constantly struck the ground with it. At the end of this strange ceremony, the second wild woman effortlessly picked up the boy with one hairy hand. That accomplished, she turned towards Charley Victor, pointed the cord at him, and said, "Siwash, you'll never kill another bear." With that, the wild woman and the boy disappeared into the woods. With tears in his eyes, Charley Victor admitted to J.W. Burns that indeed he had not shot a bear nor any other animal since that fateful day. Another wild man story which J.W. Burns included in his article derives from a letter which Burns received from a young native man from Vancouver named William Point. According to the letter, Point and a native girl named Adeline August decided to pick wild hops one day in late September 1927 in the wilderness near Agassiz, British Columbia, a town located about 8 kilometers south of Harrison Hot Springs, just north of the Fraser River. When they were finished, they returned to August's father's orchard by the way of the railroad track. Along the way, August noticed something walking along the tracks in their direction. "I looked up," wrote Point, "but paid no attention to it, as I thought it was some person on his way to Agassiz. But as he came closer, we noticed that his appearance was very odd, and on coming still closer, he stood still and were astonished, seeing that the creature was naked and covered with hair like an animal. Nearly scared stiff, Point picked up 2 stones with which he intended to hit the creature if it decided to attack him or August. He was twice as big as the average man, Point wrote of the creature, with hands so long that they almost touched the ground. It seemed to me that his eyes were very large and the lower part of his nose was wide and spread over the greater part of his face." Terrified at the creature's appearance, the teenagers ran all the way to Agassiz. There they told the story of their encounter to a group of natives who were enjoying themselves after a day of berry picking. The elders there informed them that the creature belonged to a race of hairy giants who had always lived in the mountains, making their homes in tunnels and caves. There are 2 factors which make J.W. Burns' 1929 article in Maclean's magazine especially remarkable. The first is that, in Charley Victor's tale of the Wild Woman of Hatzic, the wild woman around whom the story revolves demonstrated the ability to speak, incidentally, in the dialect of the Douglas First Nation. To the best of this author's knowledge, this is the first of only 2 stories in which a North American wild man is purported to speak using human language. The second factor which makes Burns's 1929 article truly remarkable is that it is widely believed to be the first instance in which the word Sasquatch appears in print. Although there are older articles which reference the wild men of the Pacific Northwest, Burns's is supposedly the first to actually refer to these creatures as Sasquatch, the name we know them by today. Most sources which purport to explain the etymology of Sasquatch claim that the word is Burns's Anglophonic perversion of the word Sasquatch, a Hochemalam word meaning hairy mountain man. Hochemalam being a Coast Salish language spoken by the Chehalis, the Squaw, and other indigenous groups from the Fraser Delta. One researcher named Gian Quasar put forth an interesting alternative theory regarding the origin of the word Sasquatch in his book Recasting Bigfoot. Quasar claimed that the word Sasquatch was really a combination of 2 words, Saskahua and Kinkoch. Saskahua, Quasar claimed, was the British Columbian district for which J.W. Burns became an Indian agent, and Kinkoch, Quasar correctly pointed out, is a Chinook jargon term meaning English, which derived from the words King George. Chinook jargon being an old pidgin trade language endemic to the Pacific Northwest. According to Quasar, the Coast Salish Indians from the Fraser Delta area referred to hairy wild men as Saskahua Kinkoch, literally Englishmen from Saskahua. J.W. Burns, Quasar claims, contracted this phrase into a simpler word, Sasquatch. There's one major potential problem with Quasar's theory. To the best of this author's knowledge, there was never a Saskahua district in British Columbia. A closer look at J.W. Burns' 1929 article reveals that the truth behind the origin of the word Sasquatch may have evaded both Gian, Quasar, and mainstream etymologists. In his article, Burns quotes Squaw Indian Charley Victor as saying of BC's hairy giants, "The strange people, of whom there are but a few now, rarely seen and seldom met, are known by the name of Sasquatch, or the hairy mountain men." Even more importantly, Burns later quotes directly from a letter written by William Point, the young native man from Vancouver who saw a wild man on the railroad tracks near Agassiz. An excerpt from this letter reads, "Old Indians who were present said the wild man was no doubt a Sasquatch, a tribe of hairy people whom they claim have always lived in the mountains, in tunnels and caves." Assuming that Burns faithfully recorded these lines as they were said and written, it appears that the word Sasquatch may actually be an old Hulkamalem word, or at the very least William Point's interpretation of the Chehalis word for BC's hairy wild men, and not some distortion of J.W. Burns. At the beginning of this video, we learned that Mount Keenan, formerly Mount Morris, home of the Sasquatch Mountain Resort, is the birthplace of the word Sasquatch. Indeed, this landmark is the setting for the first story of Burns's article, in which Chehalis man Peter Williams had a brush with an angry Sasquatch at the mountain's base. In 1940, Burns wrote another even more dramatic story of a Sasquatch encounter on Mount Keenan, which is perhaps the most extraordinary Sasquatch story ever written. This tale is so remarkable that it deserves a video all to itself. Join us again next week to discover this incredible story behind the naming of the Sasquatch Mountain Resort.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help support this channel, please check out my book, Mysteries of Canada Volume 1, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.